this next session is so cool. It's outer space. And we're really excited to be able to bring this to you. And I think the parallels part of this title, I think, is the most exciting part, to see the parallels with outer space and healthcare. So I'm going to first welcome Dr. Ayyanar Sawyer, whose title is incredibly long, but she is so knowledgeable and just undertook, she's got a new role at the NASA, what is it, at the Translational, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, she's going to tell you all about it.
Hello, and thank you very much for this opportunity. And what a great crowd here. And I've already seen so many friendly faces, so I always love coming to this meeting. Jill, it's an excellent meeting. So I have a great opportunity today to talk with an astronaut. And I'm involved in space health. I'm not an astronaut, but I am often accused of being a space cadet, so there's some qualification there. I'm actually an orthopedist at UCSF and have been working in bone health and also health technology, so it's an intersection where things have come together for me in becoming the Chief Health Innovation Officer for the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, which is a NASA-funded initiative. So what I'm really, really interested in always is the hybrid vigor of bringing different disciplines together, different arenas together. So we're going to be looking at lessons shared across the universe, from deep space to deep health and back again. So very quickly, NASA is dedicated to providing astronauts with capacity for early detection, intervention, and recovery from deviations from optimal health and performance that will predict or identify illness or injury. So obviously, this includes a tremendous amount of capacity, and we're building out bits and pieces of it with every mission that goes up, and actually every astronaut that goes up. We add new capabilities around this. And ultimately, as we move towards deep space, all of that support that we're doing around health, wellness, and then enacting interventions for medical care is going to have to be autonomous, because the delay is too much in terms of support for health intervention. So it's incredibly challenging to provide this arena of health sensing matrix with smart responses, et cetera. So the questions they're asking are, how do we get to that ultimately, especially going out into deep space? There are lots and lots of research initiatives, simulation initiatives, innovation initiatives at NASA. So there's a tremendous amount of effort going on in this. And there are even analogs on Earth where they actually test and validate and sometimes reiterate on some of these health interventions. Then there's also the living laboratory, and for most of us, we're familiar with the space station, but there have been many missions and opportunities ahead to learn things. And up there in the living laboratory, we're learning a tremendous amount about the health risks and also ways to assess them and ways to intervene when needed. And I think you've seen many pictures of this. If you're not familiar with the NASA channel, it's highly addicting, and I recommend it to you, because the other living laboratory is the one that we're spending all our energies in this room, which is around transforming healthcare with innovations in personnel, process, and technology. So that living laboratory is also a great resource to NASA and vice versa. And so they actually are reaching outside of NASA. There is tremendous R&D going on there, but they're reaching outside now, and I want to spend a second telling you about this because I think it could pertain to you. The Translational Research Institute for Space Health, which I've spelled wrong here, is actually anchored at Baylor and partnered with Caltech and MIT, and then I've added this role from UCSF. And we're really now responsible for sourcing and validating solutions. And solutions that, when integrated, can compromise a data-driven and comprehensive, evidence-based, and very responsive autonomous health system with these key components, which I won't read off to you, but they're all across the sector of what we're working on. And our goal ultimately is to provide NASA with evidence-based and space-appropriate health medical innovations, which could be technology, process, or knowledge. And space appropriate obviously means that it'll function in the space environment, whether it's the microgravity environment or 1/3 or 5/8 or whatever it is, depending on what mission they're on. And then also with the fluid shifts and dynamics that are totally different with that. So that needs to be space ready and space adapted. And then They're working on this through Trish because it's an outward-facing organization by tapping the rich and vibrant communities of entrepreneurs, academicians, and innovative large companies. So I'm inviting all of you to look up some websites. There are 2 big solicitations out right now. This one is from Nspires, and since most people take pictures, I went ahead and put this really long email address on here. This one is more academic-facing, earlier stage innovations, and the other one is being facilitated by CIMMIT at MIT, and that one's more focused towards startups. But you see the dates are really quick. So for the startup proposals, look at January 25th as the date and February 14th on the Brash proposals. So when we talk about how do we get there from here by leveraging the health tech community to feed back into the astronaut wellness program, we also want to know what can they bring back by investing money in those technologies or those innovations and those learnings. What can be brought back to improve healthcare on Earth? Because for all of us, we know that we have big gaps here still. So we already know there are lessons we've brought back around back pain, intervertebral disc, personally in my clinical world, bone loss, muscle loss, et cetera. There's also swelling of the eye that's becoming a very important problem. And as we go into deep space radiation exposure, this is an example of a robot with AI capability that's been introduced. And we're also now seeing capabilities that Kate Rubin's introduced, which is actually doing DNA testing up on the space station. So that's incredibly exciting as well. So a lot of the capabilities that are moving out there and being tested out there will have great applicability down here where we're trying to get more distributed but not diluted healthcare. And then of course looking at the long-term effects, and most of you are familiar with astronaut Kelly and his year journey and the long-term effects that we're being able to study. But nobody knows this better than someone who has been to the living laboratory and actually is also a physician and is also an entrepreneur. So one of these amazing, what I call intersection people. And he's the type of person that makes great inflection points in innovation. So I am very happy to talk to Scott Parazynski today, and I'm gonna let him introduce himself further and give us insights that he has from deep space to deep health.
Thank you so much. I'll borrow that from you. Thanks, Ayyanar. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm just so excited to be part of this conference. It's such an exciting time in healthcare. It's going to take a little time to swap laptops here, but what I'm going to do is take you to some really unusual places that you may not have been, outer space, to the top of Mount Everest, maybe even inside an active volcano. And the reason I bring these expeditions up, these chapters in my life, is because they're an incredible catalyst for innovation, and things that we do to go safely into extreme environments invariably have incredible rewards for all of us back down here on Earth. And so, good, we've got our slides up. So a quick biopic on myself. This sharp-dressed young man is me at age 5 with stars in my eyes. I grew up in the shadow of the Apollo program. My father worked on Apollo as a kid, and so I had the ambitions to set the first boot prints down on Mars. Did not work out that way for me, but I think that's imminent, actually. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Not for me personally, but I think the first Martians have been born and they're about to set sail in the next few years. But I have been to some extraordinary places on some epic spacewalks deep beneath our oceans to the top of Mount Everest and to the South Pole and other things, places beyond. But what I am driven by is just this sense that we have both an opportunity and an obligation to innovate, especially in healthcare. If we didn't continually ask the question, how can we do things better? How can we improve outcomes? How can we ameliorate pain? How can we make them more cost effective? We'd still be doing bloodletting for everything that ailed us, right? It would be a disaster. So pushing the boundaries at all times is what we all need to do here in healthcare. But I'm also really excited about the current state of our space program. It's really sort of the transition from the barnstorming era of spaceflight now to really opening up the heavens through commercial human spaceflight through entrepreneurs. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, who's mentioned earlier, Sir Richard Branson, and others. Actually, Robert Bigelow here in town has Bigelow Aerospace. These are highly successful multi-billionaires who are now investing in the future to open up space travel for all of us. And I think the most audacious of these entrepreneurs is Elon Musk. He actually wants to build enormous rockets that would take about 100 people at a time to go colonize Mars. He calls these rockets BFR, which I think stands for Big Fun Rocket. I'm not sure exactly what that acronym stands for, but it's really incredible that in this day and age we have the ability to think that boldly, and it actually might happen. But I wish I had time to tell you about all of my 5 missions into space, but I will point out that these are the 5 most beautiful space shuttle patches ever designed. But all international crews, and that's another wonderful thing about the space program. It brings together the best and brightest scientists and engineers advancing science for humanity. So it was a real thrill for me to spend 17 years at NASA. But one of the highlights for me was getting a chance to fly in space with one of my boyhood heroes, John Glenn, who you may recall was our first American to orbit the Earth in 1962. And he came back at age 77, and I was assigned as his personal physician, which was exciting, but also really terrifying, because if something happened to John, I might as well not come back home. But he did great, and one of the great experiences of my life, doing some science up on board the shuttle with John. And here we are. I'm doing some bloodletting on poor John. He was obviously an American hero, tough as nails, but he was really afraid of needles. And so he called me Count Parazynski, so I took some Halloween fangs up to space with us. I did want to reflect, since I don't have time to really talk about my entire career here in this short session, but one of the defining moments of my life was supporting this crew. This is the crew of STS-107 Columbia that we tragically lost. It was a devastating loss for the agency, our country, and the planet. But it was a time in my life when I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue flying in space. But spending time with their families, realized that we needed to do everything that we could to make it safe to fly again. And the rewards of the work that we do in space are so valuable, it was an absolute imperative. So I spent the 2.5 years following this tragedy figuring out ways to go out on spacewalks to help repair the space shuttle should it ever happen again. And it was one of the most inventive times of my life. We had to figure out how to get to parts of the space shuttle that were never meant to be visited by spacewalking astronauts. We needed to develop tools and materials and techniques to repair the damaged tiles or potentially a damaged wing on the space shuttle. And thankfully, we were able to then safely return to flight. And it was an extraordinary galvanizing time at NASA. But I do want to take you on one mission with me, and this is probably my most epic flight. It was called STS-120 to the International Space Station to assemble a new interconnecting module called Harmony to the space station, and relocate a large solar array truss from the top of the space station and plug it in out at the very tip. Now, NASA does things with lots and lots of careful analysis and thought and training and plan Bs and plan Cs, but sometimes you have to fall off of the script. There's just no way to anticipate everything that might go wrong. And so this is a wonderful crew that was able to work with ground control, mission control, to solve a really vexing problem that I'll describe in a moment. But what you see at the top here, the T-shaped structure in the center, that's actually the P6 solar array truss. And there are 2 large solar array panels that have been pulled in. And we're going to go out on spacewalks, unplug it, and move it with robotic arms out to the very tip, bolt it back together, and unfurl these solar panels if everything goes per plan. And hint, it doesn't. So we had done 3 of 5 planned spacewalks at this time. I'm all grins. I'm thinking that we've done all the hardest work on the mission, and it's kind of downhill from here. Just go out for a couple more spacewalks and come on home. Sadly, as we floated into the airlock at the end of the spacewalk, this is what happened. These solar panels that had been commanded to unfurl began to rip apart. We didn't know why. We didn't know the extent of the damage. We just knew that it was out at the very tip of the space station, further than we had ever traveled before on a spacewalk from the safety of our airlock. And this is also a fully energized solar panel. You can't turn this off in space. Even when we're in the shadow of the Earth, it's still generating lots and lots of electricity. So we had to develop procedures to safely get out to the tip of the space station using a cobbled together robotic arm with things that we had on board. This is really an Apollo 13 type of an event. We had to build repairs with the tools and materials we had on board the Space Shuttle Space Station complex. We couldn't go to Home Depot and get a solar array repair kit. We had to cobble it together. And this is George Zampt, our pilot, who built 5 of these things. We called them cufflinks, but it's about 5 feet of wire with a tether point there so that it wouldn't go floating off, and a couple of aluminum shim stock pieces crafted at the very tip that would allow us to basically bridge the gap. This is some video from my helmet camera on the 45-minute commute to work out at the very tip of the space station, really a God's eye view of our planet and the space shuttle and space station. You can see sort of there at the center of the frame where we're headed. We're going to cut out a piece of frayed guide wire that had began to rip the solar panel apart and stitch it together, putting these cufflinks across the gap. If we didn't do this, if we weren't able to stabilize the solar panel, we'd have to go out on another spacewalk and basically throw away $1 billion national asset, which would have been not a good day for NASA or for anyone else. We needed the power from this solar panel to power upcoming Japanese and European modules. So it was very delicate work. I had to have the metal wrist disconnects on my spacesuit specially insulated so I wouldn't get electrocuted. I'm glad they thought of that safety tip for me. And it went beautifully, exactly per plan. We were able to install these repairs across the breadth of the solar panel. And again, this is something that was never envisioned to have to take place. In fact, you never want to get near a solar panel in outer space in a spacesuit that's full of 100% oxygen. But there are times in life when you have to accept a higher degree of risk because the rewards are that significant. And you can do it safely if you brief it the right way. So it was an extraordinary day on the job. Certainly my best day on the job ever. And I think everyone who took part in that mission would tell you the same thing. Briefly, I'm going to take you on a couple of more expeditions and lead you to the story of my current company. But there's so many wonderful things that come out of our space program from across healthcare and material science and so many other industrial areas. But this is a cool photograph after we've undocked from the International Space Station. We're actually flying over the Himalayas, which is a nice segue for the next little segment of my talk. But for me, the training that I took for my astronaut days set me up well for going to climb the mountain of my dreams, which is Mount Everest. I'd been climbing since I was in my early teens. And so for me, it really wasn't about making the summit. It was about making it a round trip, which is an important element of that. My very first trip into space, I took this beautiful photograph looking straight down on the summit of Mount Everest, and I had this beautiful blow-up of the mountain over my desk for many years, and I would always daydream, what would it look like to actually put my own boot prints there? So in 2008, I had my first shot at going to Mount Everest, and I read everything that you could possibly read about not only the successes on Mount Everest, but the failures, because you can almost learn more from how people have failed than hearing about how wonderful their successes were. And so, has anyone read the book Into Thin Air? It's by John Krakauer. It's one of the most compelling books you'll ever read. And I used it as sort of a guidebook of what not to do on Mount Everest. But one of the things that I learned is that many climbers, Himalayan climbers, get up to the top of high peaks and they run out of water. Pretty basic thing, right? They end up with 3 liters of frozen ice in their backpack. So I invented a hydration system that would sit inside my down suit that had a closed feedback heater loop on the straw so that it would never freeze, so I would stay well hydrated on my summit. Sadly, this first attempt on Mount Everest didn't quite make it to the top. I made it up to about 24,000 feet above sea level where we start to use supplemental oxygen. And I didn't know it at the time, but I had ruptured a disc in my low back. Bad place to have a disc injury, by the way, and because there's no one that's going to carry you down. You're under your own power to descend, or you're going to spend the rest of your days there. So had to make a difficult decision to turn my back on the summit. It was only literally 24 hours away in climbing time, and as I like to point out, I had an unlimited supply of ice. And so about every 20 or 30 minutes or so, I would lay down on the ice as best I could and ice my back down and then continue the hobble down to Everest Base Camp. Ended up getting back home to Houston and had surgery, a microdiscectomy, and turned around the next year and was able to make a foray up to the top. And so fast forwarding 8 weeks of acclimatization on the mountain, here I am at Camp 4. We'll cross this plateau in the middle of the night and arrive on the summit here at about 4 a.m. local time. This is what it looks like arriving on the summit of Mount Everest. I was actually the team physician for a television program called Everest Beyond the Limit in its 3rd season on the Discovery Channel. So we actually had a lipstick camera that we were wearing up on top of the world, and it's an incredibly beautiful place. It's about the size of a dining room table with sheer walls on each side and covered in these beautiful Tibetan prayer flags. It's about minus 25 up here, a nice balmy day. And the sun began to rise at 4:05 in the morning. It was really spectacular. I saw the equivalent of an orbital sunrise from the top of Mount Everest. Are there any flat earthers in the room? Anybody think the earth is flat? I can guarantee it's actually round, but it's really a nice example. You know, when we think about remote medical care, we also have to think about how do you take care of astronauts in deep space? And so for places like Antarctica, where I've actually worked as well, we have good bandwidth, good transmission time, so you can actually telementor, even potentially even conduct telesurgery. But when we think about consultancy medicine on a trip to Mars, you could have a 21-minute one-way transmission and then 21 minutes back. So that's obviously going to require a totally new framework for considering healthcare. This is just an example of some of the telehealth that we performed at the South Pole Station in Antarctica. I spent a couple of years supporting that program. But there are some really cool things happening in telementoring and teleoperation of surgical assets. On the left here, there's a surgeon in Cleveland assisting or overseeing a case is Bob Thirsk, a Canadian astronaut, 55 feet beneath the Florida Keys in a habitat called Aquarius. So really unique challenges, but the fact that our entire planet is going to be online within a very short period of time. This photograph on the left was kind of interesting. When I was deep in the Khumbu region of Nepal, there were certain areas where the Sherpa people knew to go, and they had a line of sight to a cell tower, and you'd typically see a handful of Sherpas on their cell phones. But in the not too distant future, they may not have roadway access and traditional power distribution, but they will have bandwidth. And so I won't go into the details of these companies here, but we're going to have the ability to train remotely, to telementor, to actually print the tools that we need for healthcare delivery right before we need them. Really cool company called 3D4MD, run by a friend of mine. And then even having advanced beyond first aid, but really cool medical capabilities in our homes and in our offices. So I want to tell you a little bit about my company, and then I'll sit down here and we'll have a nice conversation. But we've taken so many different amazing technologies from our space program, and they've worked their ways into our intensive care units and operating rooms and into our homes. But my own personal company actually has some of its pedigree in the Mercury Program. The very first trips into space, one astronaut was in a tiny little capsule, and if they lost cabin pressurization, their entire spacesuit would inflate, and they wouldn't be able to actually reach their foot pedals and adjust the yaw, the angle of the nose of the spacecraft. So they decided, well, we'll develop a rotational hand controller that will allow even a spacesuit that's been inflated to be operated, to be able to maneuver the spacecraft in the weightlessness of space. And so fast forward a few decades and quite a bit of innovation beyond that, we've developed a technology that allows us to basically move in up to 6 degrees of freedom of motion in a single hand. And the ways in which this can touch our lives. My current company, Fluidity Technologies, is going to be focused on drone flight control, but ultimately it'll be a platform for mobility in computer gaming, augmented and virtual reality, ROVs under the ocean, and even surgical robotics. So the investments that we make in space are so vital for our futures. And this is just the technology, the FT Aviator, that we're we're releasing here at CES this year. And finally, I'll close with probably the craziest expedition I've ever been on. It was to Masaya Volcano in Nicaragua. It's the youngest lava lake in the world, and we went with a group of scientists sponsored by GE to implant a sensor network around this summit caldera and essentially collect data that would ultimately allow us to develop predictive models of eruptive activity. Think about it, there are 800 million people around the world who live in close proximity to volcanoes. And so if you could actually warn the local population that the volcano is about to erupt, you could save lots and lots of lives. So with that, I think I'll grab a seat. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
well,
Really
you know what, I'm going to ask one question. If you had to give one example, and there's probably many, but maybe one overall example of what's being done to study humans' reactions and health and things like that, that would apply to what's going on in the work that you guys are all doing, what might you answer? How might you answer that?
Well, there's so many different areas, but one of the areas that I'm most excited about now is you know, the ability to study our human genome and epigenetics and proteomics. You're probably aware that Scott Kelly, one of my colleagues, spent 340 consecutive days off of the planet, while his identical twin brother, Mark Kelly, also an astronaut, also a Navy fighter test pilot, they're incredibly identical in every way except their exposures in life. And to be able to compare and contrast how under these evolutionary challenges, how we actually change, and you can actually measure these things. So it'll be interesting to see how humanity evolves. You know, when space travel is more commonplace, maybe we'll colonize the moon and Mars within the not too distant future. Does humanity stay the same, or in reduced gravity, do we even need bones? Maybe you would be out of a job if we don't need orthopedic surgery.
It's not going to happen for a while here.
I think you're right. I think your job's secure.
You bring up a great point, though. One of the things I'm excited about, especially as we go on prolonged missions, is the accelerated aging model and learning about mitigating the consequences of that, and it applies very much to what's happening here on Earth. Scott, thank you so much.
Yeah,
You're very
thank
welcome.
you.
This is
Enjoy it.
really
Yeah.
fantastic.
Thank you very much.
How exciting. What a life, man. That's incredible.